Well, good morning. We are in Matthew chapter 24. If you have your Bible, you want to turn there with me. Matthew chapter 24. As we continue to look at Jesus' answer to the question his disciples have asked him about when will these things be? When will the destruction of the temple, which in them correlated to the end of time, and this would be the Old Testament idea of the day of the Lord. When is that going to happen? And God bring judgment on the nations, salvation for his people. This was a common element among the Old Testament prophets, that they were promising this day of the Lord was coming for all of the earth. And when Jesus begins to talk about the destruction of the temple, this brings up that idea in their minds. They've also associated his return. This is a new element that Jesus has introduced now, that he is going away and he is going to return and bring in the fullness of the kingdom. And so they are asking him about this, and Jesus begins to answer this. In the first part we looked at, he told them the birth pangs part of the story, that there will be wars and rumors of wars, there will be false messiahs and teachers and these kinds of things leading people astray, there will be persecutions and tribulations, but that's not the end. That's just kind of the beginning of the story. Now we get to his return. And he's going to speak about that in a couple of verses here. We're going to unpack that a little bit, put it in some context here, and talk about what that means for us. We may even try to answer the question, are we in the end times? So, let's look at what we have here. We've gotten down to about verse 25, where Jesus says to them, "Behold, I have told you in advance." Now, why is he telling them this in advance? Why is it necessary or important for him to say this to them ahead of time? This is so that they are not deceived. He goes on to say, "If therefore they say to you, behold, he, the Christ, the Messiah, is in the wilderness, do not go forth. Or behold, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe them. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather." So he tells them in advance so that they are not deceived, because there's going to be deception around this. There are going to be those who are false messiahs, who bring false ideas, who claim that the Christ has come, that the Messiah is going to come or has come or is here or is there. And he doesn't want them to be deceived by any of that. And so he's going to tell them clearly that his second coming will be substantially and dramatically different than his first coming. His first coming was in humility. His first coming was in meekness. His first coming was almost quiet. He came as an infant. He came not in Jerusalem, but in Bethlehem. He came to two people no one has ever heard of before until this point. The people at his birth, a handful of shepherds who marveled, but there wasn't a lot of fanfare there except for the angels. And then he grows up, and we know almost nothing about his early life until he comes onto the scene as an adult and begins to minister, begins to speak, begins to perform miracles. But even then, he leaves people guessing and wondering and questioning, is this the Messiah? Could it be? His first coming is very gentle and meek and humble. He's come to serve, not to be served. His second coming, he says, will not be anything like that. So if they say to you, he's over there in the wilderness, or he's over here in the mountains, or he's in the inner rooms, don't be deceived, because his second coming will be visible. It will be like lightning that flashes from the east to the west. That's what the coming of the Son of Man will look like. We often read the Son of Man title and think of it as emphasizing his humanity. Actually, it's just the opposite. The Son of Man title emphasizes his deity because it's connected back to Daniel chapter 7, which the Ancient of Days song that we just sang talks about. That the Son of Man came on the clouds in the sky up to the Ancient of Days and was given a kingdom and a throne and dominion and power over all forever and ever. That's the Son of Man in the Old Testament. And Jesus links that title here to his coming, his return on the clouds. It will be bold. It will be visible. Where the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Which is speaking to the one thing making visible the other. A number of years ago, I went hunting. I'm sorry if that bothers you, just bear with me. Hunting with a friend of mine out on his ranch, and a deer appeared just sticking out of the brush, and I took a shot at it. I was pretty sure I hit it, but we could never find it. We couldn't find a blood trail. We hunted, looked for it, could not find it. We finally had to leave and move on. And he was asking me, did you hit it? And I said, I thought I did. A couple of days later, I saw him, and he said, I found your deer. I said, well, how did you find it? Because it was in really thick, heavy brush, about 8 feet tall and just thick and hard to see. You couldn't see anything. You couldn't hardly walk in there. He says, I found the buzzards. I just followed the buzzards. It was about 50 yards away from where we were. There were buzzards circling overhead. There was the deer. That's the idea here. The one thing makes visible the reality of what is. Where the vultures are, there's the corpse. Where the vultures are, this is the visible part that you can see that's leading you to know that something else is a reality as well. All of these signs pointing to what is coming. So now in verse 29, he begins to give us even more detail. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. His return will be quick. It will be visible. All the world will see and will mourn. Zechariah 12 says, I will pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication, so that they will look on me whom they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only son, and they will weep bitterly over him. Isaiah in chapter 13 says, wail, for the day of the Lord is near. It will come as destruction from the Almighty. Therefore all hands will fall limp, and every man's heart will melt, and they will be terrified. For the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not flash forth their light. The sun will be dark when it rises. The moon will not shed its light. Thus I will punish the world for its evil and the wicked for their iniquity. Isaiah 27, it will come about in that day that a great trumpet will be blown, And those who were perishing in the land of Assyria and who were scattered to the land of Egypt will come and worship the Lord in the holy mountain at Jerusalem. There are a number of Old Testament texts that use this imagery, and that's exactly where Jesus is pulling this imagery from. God has revealed this to many of the prophets. Some of the prophecies that they use this language to refer to were about the Babylonian captivity, that the destruction would come upon Jerusalem and on the people of God, and it would be a day of mourning for them, but eventually there would be this restoration. But some of those passages look beyond to another day of the Lord that is coming. And Jesus is using that same type of imagery here to speak of what his coming will look like. He will come in great power and in great glory. That is obviously very different from his first incarnation, the way he came the first time. There will be sounds of trumpets. Trumpets were used in the Old Testament and in the ancient Near Eastern world as a whole to call people together for worship, for war, to alert them to something that was coming. That's the idea here, that these trumpets will sound announcing the coming of the King and the gathering of the people. He's coming on clouds and in power and glory. This was the Old Testament view of God. God came on the clouds of thunderstorms with lightning flashing and fire in the midst of it. And it shook the earth whenever he showed himself. This idea is now surrounding this appearance of the Son of Man, sending his angels to gather the elect. There are two groups of people involved in this coming. The elect will be gathered. His people will be gathered to him. The world will mourn over his coming. The peoples of the earth will see this. But they will mourn because this is a day of judgment, as well as a day of salvation for his people. The New Testament continues these themes and ideas. Paul specifically writes of them to the Thessalonians. Let me turn there real quick. In 1 Thessalonians, the end of chapter 4 and into the beginning of chapter 5, he has this to say: "For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep in Jesus. For this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord shall not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise first. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And thus we shall always be with the Lord." He continues, "As to the times and the epochs, brethren, you have no need of anything to be written to you. For you yourselves know full well that the day of the Lord will come just like a thief in the night. While they are saying peace and safety, then destruction will come upon them suddenly, like birth pangs upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. But you, brethren, are not in darkness, that the day should overtake you like a thief." This is what Jesus is telling his disciples here. I am telling you these things. I am warning you ahead of time so that you are not unaware of what is going to happen, so that you are not overtaken, so that you are about the things that you are supposed to be doing, and we'll talk more about that as we get into the next section and into chapter 25. But Paul is understanding what Jesus is saying here and giving it to The Thessalonians, who have either on their own or through some false teacher come to the conclusion that maybe Jesus already came and they missed it somehow. And so Paul reminds them, let me remind you what Jesus said. His coming is going to not be quiet and sneaky and subversive and some secret that only some people know. It won't be invisible. It will be in glory and power and visible and loud. Revelation chapter 19 gives us the imagery of heaven opened and a white horse, and he who sat upon it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness are following him on white horses. From his mouth comes a sharp sword, so that with it he may smite the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. And he treads the winepress of the fierce wrath of God the Almighty. And on his robe and on his thigh he has a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. This is what Jesus' return will entail. So he doesn't want them to be deceived, so that they, like the Thessalonians, don't somehow think they've missed it. He wants them to be prepared. He goes on to say, beginning in verse 32, that we should learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. This is the metaphor. When it puts forth its leaves, that is the sign of something else that is coming. Even so, you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words shall not pass away. Jesus here equates his words to that of the words of God in the Old Testament. That's a pretty bold thing to say, isn't it? He says here that this generation will not pass away until these things take place. Now again, going back to our beginning point with chapter 24, there are three basic ways to interpret this chapter. One is seeing it as having taken place in the past. One is seeing it as taking place at some point in the future. And then one is a combination of both. Those who view this as taking place in the past take a verse like this, where this generation will not pass away until these things. And the things that Jesus said at the end of chapter 23 and at the beginning of chapter 24 in answer to their questions, that all this is rooted in that generation. Which is, there's a lot of truth in that, as we talked about. The difficulty is with the return of Christ and what is being talked about here in verses 27 to 31, which seems to have not been fulfilled there in the past. It seems to be yet future. That's the problem for those who take this as all having occurred in the past. Those who view this as all having occurred in the future have to explain verses like this one, verse 34, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place, as well as the other references to that original first century context. I've heard a number of different approaches to that. One was that this generation refers to the generation that will be alive in the future when these things begin to take place, but that does too much damage to the context here. Interestingly, if we read verse 34 in context, it tells us, I think, how to interpret the verse. Because what has he said in the 2 verses before this? He said, learn the parable of the fig tree. That when it puts forth leaves, then you know that the summer is coming. Even so, you too, when you see these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. What are these things? These things are the signs leading up to his coming. So then he says, all these things, which things? All of the signs leading up to his coming will be fulfilled in that generation at the time, those including the disciples. So I think Jesus roots all of this in the first century context, that the signs will be fulfilled with the destruction of the temple, which happened at the hands of the Romans in 70 AD. They laid siege to the city of Jerusalem and destroyed it and took the temple apart. There was not one stone left upon another. And Jesus says these things will take place in this generation. And so all of that, I think, is rooted there in that first century with that generation. The apostles were a part of seeing all of that take place. Then you know that he is at the door. Then you know you are looking for the next part, his return. So I think that's the contextual way to understand verse 34 is with 32 and 33. So this generation, the disciples there, will not pass away until they see the destruction of the temple and the tribulation that goes along with that, all of that take place. Then you know that he is at the door. So I think we're looking at a past and future understanding of what is taking place here. Most of chapter 24 is fulfilled there in that context. Jesus brings judgment, God brings judgment on his people, just as Jesus said at the end of 23. And into the beginning of 24, he has condemned the temple and the leadership and Jerusalem as a whole because of their rejection of him as Messiah. And there is going to be destruction and tribulation and persecution like they have never seen before on them, and that is all fulfilled there. Then there is yet a future return of Christ, which has yet to happen, which he details in his words here in 27 to 31, that it will come in this way. So then he says, after saying, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words shall not pass away, verse 36, but of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. Which raises another question, doesn't it? How can Jesus not know something? If Jesus is fully God, how can he not know something that the Father knows? Aren't the Father and the Son one? How can he not know? The answer to that, I think, is clear in our understanding of the incarnation. Jesus in the incarnation, Paul brings us out in Philippians chapter 2, limited himself in the exercise and the application, if you will, of his deity. That is, we know from Scripture that God is omnipresent, omnipotent, that he is omniscient, that God knows everything, sees everything, is all-powerful, and is present everywhere. And yet Jesus in his incarnation was not those things. He was not everywhere. He was located in the physical body of his incarnation. He was not everywhere. He was right there. He limited himself in that way when he became man and took on human flesh. We see at times that he exercised his omniscience. He knew what other people were thinking at times, but not all the time. At times he exercised his omnipotence, his power, walking on water, turning water into wine, raising the dead, healing, casting out demons. He exercised his power, but not all the time. Most of the places he walked, rode in boats across the water. Could he walk on water? Yes. Could he disappear and appear somewhere else? I mean, God could certainly do that. He could have told the disciples, you guys go on to Jerusalem, I will meet you there because actually I'm already there. But he didn't exercise those parts of his deity on a regular basis. He limited himself. So in his incarnation, as he is standing there before them, he can say to them, only the Father knows this information. The Son in his incarnation does not know that. Now, does he know it now in heaven? That question isn't really answered. I would assume that in his resurrection and ascension, he now has assumed his full deity and the exercise thereof, and so now knows that. But at this point in time, he says he does not know because he has limited himself in that aspect of his deity. So I don't think it is a problem at all for our understanding of who Jesus is in him saying this. So what do we have here? Well, let's break this down into two categories. What do we know and what do we not know? What we know are that there are precursors to this fulfilled in the first century. And we know that his second coming is going to be this marvelous, cosmic, visibly loud, gathering event that all the world will see. Even if we understand that he may be speaking metaphorically or symbolically in some of the details here, that idea that it is going to be this worldwide event is unmistakable. His return is going to be marvelous in power and great glory. What do we not know? We don't know when. He's very clear about that, isn't he? We don't know when. Interestingly, that has not stopped us from speculating, has it? The 2nd and 3rd century Roman clergymen calculated that Jesus would return in AD 500. His prediction was based on the dimensions of Noah's Ark. January 1st, 1000, many Christians in Europe predicted the end of the world, and therefore the coming of the millennium and the return of Christ. 1415, the Taborites predicted that Christ would return, especially if they defeated their persecutors. In the Middle Ages, Pope Innocent III took the number 618, the year Islam was founded, and added the number 666, the number of the beast, to get 1284 as the year of Christ's return. February 14th, 1835, Joseph Smith, the founder of the Church of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, announced that Jesus would return within 56 years. Unfortunately, he was murdered before that. Others said the second coming would be between 1843 and 1844. In 1874, Charles Russell, founder of a movement that became Jehovah's Witnesses, predicted the rapture in 1910, with an invisible return of Christ in 1914. In 1986, the group The Children of God predicted Russia would defeat the United States and Israel, establishing a worldwide dictatorship, and then Christ would return in 1993. There were several predictions in 1988 based on the 40-year generation, biblical idea of generation, and Israel's founding as a nation in 1948, that Christ would return in 1988. There were books written, why the rapture is in 1988, why Christ returns in 1988, 88 reasons why this will happen in 1988. Lee Jang Rim of the Church Mission for the coming days prophesied that Jesus would return through Sydney Harbor on October 28, 1992. 1998, a Taiwanese cult in Texas claimed that Christ would return and invited the faithful followers aboard a UFO. 1998, the psychic Edward Case taught that a secret underground chamber would be discovered in Egypt underneath the Great Sphinx, which would unleash the prophecies that would lead to the end and Christ's return. Harold Camping predicted the end of the world in 2011. He put up billboards saying the Bible guarantees it. And there are many others we could talk about. What do they all have in common? Every single one of them was wrong. Why? Because what do we not know? The when. We do not know the when. Should we try to figure out the when? No. Should we waste our time trying to calculate the when? No. Have we been given that information? No. Jesus said he didn't even have the information in his incarnation. If anyone would have that information, he would be the one, and he didn't. We are not just wasting our time, we are foolish and disobedient if we are trying to calculate the when. That's what we don't know. Why? Because God does not want us to know the when. What do we know? We know the signs leading up to it, and we know what this will look like on a grand scale. Therefore, as Paul says to the Thessalonians, we can comfort one another with these words. Now, are we therefore in the end times? The answer to that from the point of view of Matthew 24 is yes. The end times began in 70 with the destruction of the temple. At that point, the signs are fulfilled. We are in the period of waiting for the coming of the Lord. Which is why, throughout its 2,000-year history, Christians have repeatedly thought this must be the end. Why were they thinking that? Because they were paying attention to what Jesus said. So anytime it begins to look like things are ramping up this way and the signs are growing, Christians rightfully think this might be the end. In that sense, we are in the end times. Are we in the actual end times in the very last days when Christ is coming right tomorrow, next day, whatever? What's wrong with that question? We don't know and can't know. That's the problem. We can't answer that question. So are we in the end times? Yes. Are we at the very last second? Is the clock about to strike midnight? We don't know. Which then helps us to put what's happening in Israel, say, in proper focus. What's happening in Israel is horrible and should be condemned by everyone, what has been done to Israel. Now, the larger picture is a little more complicated than that, isn't it? But the terrorist attack on Israel should be condemned, and the atrocities that have been carried out. And we can talk about all the details in politics and so forth later. What does this have to do with the end times idea? Well, it may have a lot to do with it, or it may have nothing to do with it. And again, this is the problem. So all those people who looked at the founding of Israel as a nation in 1948 and went to the Bible and said, aha, Israel's back in the land, now we're ready to start the clock. What did Jesus say to the Jewish people at the end of chapter 23 and moving into chapter 24? You will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. As far as the nation of Israel is concerned, what is necessary for them that is a signal of the return of Jesus? It is their recognition of him as Messiah. Did that happen with the founding of Israel in 1948? No. A secular nation was founded in 1948. It was not a return of the Jewish people to the Messiah. It was a return of the Jewish people to a land. Now, nothing wrong with that. In fact, it was a good thing that they returned to the land. But was it fulfillment of biblical prophecy connected to the end times events? We don't know. God might use that nation founded at that time as part of what he is doing in bringing the Jewish people to himself that will then fold into the return of Christ. Or maybe not. Again, what do we not know? We don't know the when. We haven't been given enough information to calculate the when. On purpose. So we should stop trying. We should stop asking that question. We should understand, are we in the end times? Yes, for 2,000 years we've been in the end times. As far as Matthew 24 is concerned, we are in that time period. So when is the ultimate end? That we don't know. That we have to wait for. What we do in the meantime is what Jesus turns to next, and we'll get into that next week as we'll begin to talk about what we are to do now that we are in the end times. How are we to act? How are we to live? What are we to do while we wait, however long that is going to be? Those listening to Jesus at the time, the apostles at the time, interpreted what Jesus said to mean that he would return in their lifetimes. It wasn't because they were foolish. They interpreted rightly what Jesus said and came to the conclusion that he's probably coming back before we die. Because that would be a logical conclusion to what Jesus told them. When they began to die, the others, the next generation, thought, well, it'll certainly be in our lifetimes. And then when the persecutions of the Roman Empire ramped up, Nero, Caligula, Diocletian, they certainly looked around and said, if this isn't it, if this isn't what Jesus was talking about, I don't know what counts. And that's why we've read all these passages of predictions of, hey, things are looking like it's getting worse. World War II, people thought, this must be it. World War I, people thought, this must be it. Israel's founded in 1948, people thought, this must be it. 67 war, the 73 war, this must be it. Possible nuclear war with Russia in the Cold War, this must be it. What do we not know? We don't know when. So we should stop asking that question. Are we in the end times? Yes. How far? How close? Don't know. So next week, come back and we'll find out what we're supposed to do in the end times while we wait for the coming of the Lord. Let me close this in prayer. Lord, we thank you for your goodness, that you have provided us with this information to allow us not to fear what is to come, but to look forward to it with hope, because we know whom we have believed, and that he is able to keep us and preserve us unto the end. We know that you are returning in power and great glory to send forth your angels to gather your elect from all over the earth. And thus, as Paul says, we will always be with the Lord. So we need not fear the end. We need not fear the tribulations. In fact, we can look forward to what you are going to do, even though we are not exactly sure when it will unfold. We're thankful that you gave us your word so that we are not deceived, looking in the wrong places and under rocks and in secret hiding places for the coming of Messiah. But that your return will be a glorious, visible, loud, cosmic event.